And we are live. Welcome to the Against the Stream podcast on Thursday, 6th of February. Shock and awe. I think that is one of the best ways to explain the past few weeks of events, in particular coming out of the US and the actions of Donald Trump in the first weeks of his term as president, of his second term as a president. Trump's blitz on world and domestic politics has thrown everything, I think we can confidently say, into the air, and has caused uncertainty and instability around the world. But our task today, as communists and as Marxists, is not just to follow every single individual lead and line and try to understand it on its own, but try to dive deeper and see what all of this really represents in world politics and for the class struggle. My name is Hamid Alizadeh. Today I'm here with Jorge Martin from the Revolutionary Communists International, and we'll be taking a deep dive into the different aspects of Trump's policies and discuss their effect on the class struggle. Now, Jorge, to begin with, I thought we can discuss one of the first things that kind of shook the world after Trump entered office, which was this announcement, out of the blue almost, that he was going to impose tariffs on Mexico, 25% tariffs on Mexico, on Canada, and 10% tariffs on China. And in the beginning, he even said, we're not even asking for anything. We're just going to do it, and we're going to see what's going to happen. He didn't want to negotiate. Later on, of course, it seems like he backtracked for what was not very big concessions. Now, what do you make of all of this?
I think there's two elements to this, or maybe even three elements. But the first one is that this is part of Trump's negotiating tactics, isn't it? He imposes tariffs or makes some bold move in order to show power, and then he's prepared to negotiate something away, reach a compromise, an agreement. I think that basically the aim, if you read the fact sheet that they produced to justify these tariffs, it talks particularly on I think also on China, but mainly on Mexico and Canada. It talks a lot about fentanyl, illegal drugs going over the border, illegal migrants going over the border. But this is not really the essence of this, isn't it? I think what Trump is trying, because there's only a very small amount of fentanyl that goes through the Canadian border into the US. Yeah. In fact, some people in Canada were saying, no, there's actually more illegal migrants going north than going south over that border. But basically, I think that what he meant was, he even said that the Mexican government is in an alliance with the drug cartels, which is quite an outrageous accusation.
Terrorist organization.
A terrorist organization. So basically, it has nothing to do with fentanyl. It has to do with, one, establishing Trump as a resolute president that takes decisive action on things that he has mentioned during the campaign, i.e. drug trafficking, the illegal migrants, who are also being deported in a very demonstrative way in military planes, chained and shackled. And it's for the optics, for propaganda purposes, number one. Number two, he is also establishing the real relationship that exists between the US and its main trading partners, in this case, Mexico and Canada, which is a relationship of economic domination. In the second part of this fact sheet that they produced, it says, the US has enormous economic leverage, which other presidents haven't used, and Trump is going to use to achieve aims that are for the benefit of the US. So that's number two. And number three, I think it's basically that Trump's policy is that he thinks that his country, the US, has a massive trade deficit with many other countries around the world, and he wants to reverse that relationship. He wants to force companies to come and invest in the United States, create jobs in the United States, and also force other countries to buy more U.S. products. He thinks that this is a simple economic equation that he can get away with. I think that these are the three main reasons for his actions. But obviously his actions are extremely destabilizing, because even the threat of tariffs, not sanctions, but it's basically the same thing, isn't it? It's using economic power to submit your in this case, it's not even your enemy, it's your closest allies and trading partners. And so I think that this is a complete change in the way U.S. imperialism carries out its foreign policy.
Although I would add to that Biden did similar things, although not in the same with the same
style.
level of aggression and style and crudeness.
Yeah, protectionism was a trend in U.S. economic policy for some time.
I think one of the things that really defined Trump, and which we can see in all of the different spheres, is that he derives at the ultimate logical conclusion of a process that was already there. We explained many times that capitalism is in a organic crisis, i.e., even though there are still booms and slumps, the economic booms that we see are very, very weak, and the slumps are much, much deeper. And there's a long-term downward facing trend, which means that the competition between capitalist powers is increasing, even between allies. Whereas in the post-war period, America could afford to let Europe prosper, as European capitalism prosper, because it saw it as important in relation to countering the Soviet Union. Now we see the opposite. Whereas Biden began the Ukraine war partially aimed at weakening Europe, partially aimed at undermining Europe's energy supplies, which has now led to massive deindustrialization in Germany and France. We've talked about this many times. And also he introduced a series of economic policies, which were the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which basically subsidized or penalized companies European companies in particular, which would in order to force them to move to the US. And
at the time, the German foreign minister, or was it the German finance minister, he said this is a declaration of war on European industry.
Exactly, which it was. And I think what we see Trump doing, that basically injecting some steroids in that process, because this was not just a process in the US, by the way. This is a process all countries were increasingly trying to carve up their own little economic spheres and protect their own base while exporting their crises. This is, again, what we talked about before. And I think... I was distracted by someone sending me a message on my screen. But what the consequences of all of this is what? First of all, this is a race to the bottom. This is, Trump raises tariffs. The Chinese immediately raise tariffs, which are to go in effect from today. And in general, it undermines world trade. Now, world trade, a big part of world trade relies on trust. Actually, a trust that was built up in the post-war period, in the capitalist world at least, on the basis of a massive boom, but using that boom to establish trade routes and institutions, and when that, as you say, the trust disappears, it's not just a immediate thing that we're not going to invest in the US next month. It's generally the idea of long-term investments in world trade, in an international division of labor, that disappears, which does what? Which undermines the productive forces. Because it's silly to have, if you have, let's say, production of whatever, microphones, right? To have the same kind of high-end production in many, many different parts of the world, whereas in reality, putting all of these kind of electronic equipment and producing them in one area or in a couple of areas would be far more efficient, and would raise productivity.
Basically, for 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a process of what was described by bourgeois economists as globalization, which basically meant the lowering of tariff barriers, the opening up of the world market, not to the benefit of everyone, to the benefit of the strongest capitalist
of U.S.
powers,
imperialism.
U.S. imperialism. Many, for instance, I know in many Latin American countries, tariff barriers were lowered. Public services and utilities were privatized, water, electricity, all this was opened up for foreign investment, and imperialist countries, massive multinational companies made a lot of money out of this, but the world economy became extremely integrated. Supply chains, you had delocalization of industries, going to lower wage countries and so on. So this is the world that we had up until very recently. In the last few years, because of the shock of economic crisis, particularly starting in 2008, this process has started to be rolled back, the rolling back of globalization, and the breaking up of the world economy into warring, trading blocks.
It's interesting because, in the post-war period, America, U.S. imperialism was the one that was arguing for the opening up of trade barriers. It was imposing, in fact, on countries all over the world to open their borders, talking about free trade. At that point, it was because U.S. productivity was higher than anywhere in the world, i.e. the Americans, because of their high level of technology and industry, infrastructure and so on, their cheap goods could penetrate every market. And by those means, they actually crushed.
And also through the export of capital, foreign direct investment.
Exactly. That has now turned to its opposite. The U.S. has become decrepit, decayed. You can say the American capitalism is in a dead end. And instead, you had these rising powers, such as China, for example, and other places, which on production at least competes. And in many other spheres are building up their own kind of strength with which the Americans...
You can see that, for instance, in relation to electric vehicles. Up until very recently, Tesla was the world's largest producer of electric vehicles, had an advantage over other companies, but now is BYD, a Chinese company, is now the world's largest maker of pure electric vehicles. Then you had the incident with DeepSeek 2 weeks ago. Basically a startup company in China that didn't exist 2 years ago that's created a system of large language model for artificial intelligence, which now they say it's equal or superior to some of the Western US-based models. So on the basis of this, i.e. the competition between China, a rising imperialist power, and the US, a relatively declining imperialist power, what you have is the US turning towards protectionism, bringing the state in to try. For instance, the United States has already imposed 100% tariffs on the importation of Chinese electric vehicles. And still, electric vehicles from China are cheaper and more competitive than those made in the United States. This is basically the state entering into the arena to protect the interest of their own based multinational
It's interesting
companies.
because the beginnings of American capitalism and all the major powers, in fact, you see the state coming in, forming a protective barrier around its industries in order to help them develop. Once they then develop, you see this with the British Empire, the American Empire, that they turn outwards, take down the barriers because they are now much more competitive, and basically go on the offensive economically. And then but this time around, it's not in order to develop American capitalism. It's the opposite. It's to protect it so that U.S. businesses don't have to actually invest in the development of the means of production, in the development of technology and science and so on, but can still have massive profits. That's essentially what it boils down to.
There's another example of this. For instance, the tariffs on Mexico, which have now been postponed for a month. The tariffs on Mexico make very little sense from the point of view of fentanyl or drugs or anything like this. In fact, what's behind this is the fear of the United States, of U.S. capital, that China has been investing a lot in Mexico in order to bypass U.S. tariffs. Mexico has a free trade agreement with Canada and the U.S. So if Chinese companies like automobile or auto part companies invest in Mexico, then the products enter the United States free of tariffs. And this is the real reason behind the attempt to impose tariffs on Mexico. And Mexico is going to be forced by the US to control or to limit the amount that Chinese companies can invest in Mexico.
Yeah. The main thing is that Donald Trump is taking the ultimate conclusion of all of this and being decisive. And in doing so, he's coming into conflict with the way things used to be. Now, following from that, it's not just on the economic basis, but also on a more political level that the foreign policy of America is changing. We saw in the beginning, when Trump, during his election campaign, he spoke about being the peace candidate. And what did it mean? He does not believe that America should be starting and entering or supporting all of these wars all over the world. He criticizes the Iraq war. He criticizes the intervention of America in the Middle East in general. The Gaza war, that's slightly more complicated, but he did impose a ceasefire immediately, even before entering. And now he's on Ukraine, which is the spearhead, you can say, of American imperialist policy over the past five or 6 years, which was a real, key policy of the Biden administration and the whole of the American establishment. He's come out and he says, and that they must make peace. And he's made several...
This war should have never been started.
This war should never have been started. It was completely unnecessary, he said. And that he's been very friendly, in fact, he's been much more friendly towards Putin than anyone else. I think that's a part of his general outlook of world relations. And meanwhile, he said, I can't remember if it's him or his envoy. I think it's his envoy, Kellogg. Who said that we want a ceasefire as soon as possible. And in that ceasefire, we need elections. Now, what does that mean in a country like Ukraine, where Zelensky, the president, is incredibly unpopular? It essentially means we're going to throw you out, right? We don't want to have anything to do with you. And this is basically stretching out an olive branch to Putin, because Putin has been saying exactly the same thing. Putin has said, "Look, this is a president who's not legitimate because his term ran out. Was it 2 years ago?
2024, I think.
May 2024 was it? Okay,
or maybe earlier.
And then he's been expanding it by these decrees of martial law and so on. And Putin says we can negotiate with Zelensky, but he cannot sign. The person signing, and there's a certain logic to it. The person signing it must have the support and legitimacy, which follows from being the actual president of the nation. Now, Zelensky definitely is not that, and so it's clear that he's throwing Ukraine away, and he's basically saying U.S. imperialism, we don't want to have anything to do with it, while at the same time increasing pressure on Canada, increasing pressure on Greenland, the Panama Canal, the close near borders of America. And obviously that has a certain logic to it. That we've talked about this, the retrenchment of American imperialism, realizing that this way that the old gang did, Biden, the liberals, the people who basically run America for decades, they believe that America must dominate every inch of the world, and everywhere where they were challenged, they must react with force. Now we saw that in Afghanistan, in the Afghanistan war, the Iraq war, in Syria they tried to do the same thing. In Ukraine, in Libya, it was, although that was the French pushing the Americans, but they still did it, and everywhere else. In Taiwan, they've been saying, basically they've been implying that they would defend Taiwan in case of a war with China.
Provocative statements.
But Trump is saying, no, we're not playing that game anymore. We're protecting our own immediate.
In fact, you could say that Trump's policy is basically the recognition of the limits of U.S. imperialist power. They cannot do financially, politically, from any point of view, they can no longer sustain the policies that were being proposed before. That doesn't mean that Trump is not pursuing an imperialist foreign policy. He's pursuing the interest of U.S. capital, but by different means and by different strategies. For instance, even in relation to Russia, what he has intimated is that basically the main enemy or the main rival of the United States on the world arena is China. And this is clear from an economic point of view, and he wants to deal mainly with China. If he can separate Russia from China, that will be in the interest of the United States. If he can retrench and strengthen the power of the United States in North America, in this case, all the way from Greenland to the Panama Canal, he will do that. It's a different strategy. But also, I think the way in which he's doing it, right? The whole of the previous period, the United States imperialism pretended that they were defending human rights, liberal democracy, the world, multilateral in inverted commas institutions, which were not multilateral at all. They were dominated by the United States, United Nations, the IMF, and all these other institutions. And Trump says, no, why should we go to the bother of pretending any of this? We're just going to defend the interest of the United States openly. And I think that opens up quite an interesting discussion, isn't it? Because
the mask is falling.
That's right. The mask of liberalism, human rights, and all of that really disgusting mask that was used to justify the imperialist invasion of the United States in Afghanistan in defense of the rights of Afghan women, they said. In reality, it was the naked US imperialism. But now, as you say, the mask has fallen. Trump doesn't really care for diplomacy, formalities, and he's just exposing the real... When he says Greenland is very important from the point of view of national security of the United States, he's telling the truth. Maybe a previous government will have said, well, we have concerns about, the rights of the people of Greenland.
Exactly, that's what they would do.
Or when previous administration, I can't even remember which administration it was, they invaded Panama to snatch Noriega, the president, and take him out. And they said, it's because of drugs and this and that.
War on drugs.
It's nothing to do with that. It's to do with the interest. The United States has a clear strategic interest in dominating the Panama Canal.
Yeah, exactly. Now, just before we finish this, I just want to read a quote by Marco Rubio. He was an ultra hawk, but now he's been tamed. Clearly, been tamed by his little lapdog for Trump now, but. He was interviewed by Megyn Kelly, who was one of these conservative TV presenters, Trumpist person, and he said this. He said, "It's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. It was a product of the end of the Cold War. But eventually, you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, multi-great powers in different parts of the planet." And then he goes on and he explains, look, the Chinese are going to do what's best for them. The Chileans are going to do what's best for them. The Russians and the Iranians are going to do what's best for them. And we will do what's best for us. And we're not going to hide it. And I think that really goes to the core of what you're saying. This is what it's the realization that we cannot continue doing this. It's not because these are great peace-loving people. Donald Trump is not, in fact, president for peace, but it's because they realize that this is a losing for American capitalism, for the rich, for the super rich in Canada, also in Canada, but in the U.S. It's a lost cause. Why? Because the balance of forces has changed. America is not, in relative terms. It cannot dominate. You can see in Ukraine, it's being shown up. Someone was saying, Fred actually, who's also on the show very often, he said, there's an article that someone saying that Russia is outproducing the West, the collective West, 32 countries, in weapons. Well, that's a change.
In fact, there was another figure that was produced earlier on last year. which said that Russia now produces 3 million artillery shells a year.
Yes.
And the whole of NATO produces 1.2 million.
Exactly.
So
exactly, that is a shift in the balance of forces, and that will have whatever rhetoric and narrative you want to pose. Reality is going to show you the door, right? And I also just to follow on with this. So this is a kind of an admission of defeat, a retrenchment, and a complete change of course. But I would say it's
more than defeat. I will say is an admission of the limits, of the limitations, because the United States is still the most powerful imperialist power, but it's not one that can dominate everything at the same time.
Yes. But I think in terms of defeats, this is a defeat for the whole liberal world order. That's the title of the podcast today. What are we talking about? We're talking about the people who ran America since the post-war period and set up that whole order of the capitalist world with all the institutions you talked about, the international, rules-based order, and all of these things. But also in the West, all of Western governments, European governments, in one way or another, were kind of parasites onto that world order, onto that, which is over now. And they're all being left with very little to stand on. The ground is being, the carpet is being...
Yeah, they're all protesting, kicking and screaming, but there's not much they can do, because once the United States decides something, there's very little left for them to do.
And what we see is world trade, he's accelerating, whatever, even if he withdraws tomorrow and says, okay, I'm not going to do, or stops any further tariffs, the process has started. The process of retrenchment, of increasing tension between the nations. This is not his making. Obviously, this was there before. This is a product of the crisis of capitalism, but he's accelerated that process.
Definitely. It's basically the carving up of the wall between the different imperialist powers, areas of influence. It's a situation more similar to the situation that led to the First World War, rather than the situation of relative stability that there was after the Second World War between two big superpowers, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was just the one main superpower.
Now, related to this has been the whole thing about USAID. USAID is a foreign aid agency, is the main foreign aid agency of the United States, and it's called, what's it called? Anyway, the short is USAID, and this is an agency with
I think it's called the U.S. Aid and International Development.
Aid and International,
something like that.
And the Americans have a thing about acronyms and and they have a budget of $40 billion that they invest all over the world. And if you read the papers, the liberal news at least, this is a horrible thing. This happened.
Trump's put an end to it.
Trump has put an end to this extremely humanitarian program that was saving millions of lives.
In the most brutal way, by the way. Elon Musk tweeted, I don't know, at 4 a.m, and he said, we're putting US aid through the wood chipper.
Been spending the night putting the US aid through. Subsequently, that was paused. USAID was folded into the State Department under Marco Rubio. We'll get into that.
Yes.
But
they're all crying.
But actually, all of the headquarters has been shut down. All of the main staff has been told that they have, I think, 30 days leave and then 30 days to move to the US. And it's caused a lot of discomfort, let's say, for some people. 100 people at least at the top staff of this thing has been removed. But you see, the point is, and I think Bernie Sanders even, we'll get to Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was out decrying the meaning of this. And yes, it's true that USA did have humanitarian so-called programs. But behind all of these programs was always the foreign policy, and in particular, the policies of the CIA.
Yes,
foreign policy of the USA
clearly.
and the CIA.
Yes.
USAID was a front of the CIA. I saw an interview a few days ago, I can't remember who it was, who said, look, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the CIA became very unpopular because of the regime change things. Then USAID, which was set up in 61, started taking on this. USAID is nominally an independent agency, and they deal with NGOs, they deal with, human rights, and all of these things. There's a degree of separation which allows for plausible deniability for the US government. But in reality, everything they do is in the interest of US imperialism.
Clearly. I mean, this story about even when let's say they help, poor coffee farmers in Colombia, or they have a health program in some place, maybe in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or
Gaza.
Whatever they do. Even when they do that, they do it with the purpose of advancing the influence and the interest of US imperialism.
Yeah.
But there's another side to it. That is part of US imperialism. There's a whole other side of it, which is directly subversion, political influence, undermining governments. They even have a part of USAID. It's called the Office for Transition Initiative. Transition from what to what? Transition from a regime that's against the US to a regime that's a puppet of the US. And this is their open stated aim. Yes. And they fund and finance NGOs, so-called promotion of democracy, democracy building capacity, newspapers, so-called independent journalists. This is basically what they do.
Yes, I mean you posted something on your Twitter, which is a leaked WikiLeaks cable from about USAID and this OTI.
Office for Transition Initiatives
in Venezuela.
In Venezuela,
and it lists the objectives,
the aims,
the aims and objectives. This is an internal government cable. It says objective number 1: strengthening democratic institutions. Okay, that's just
the counter-revolutionary and democratic opposition, which had just carried a coup the year before.
Exactly. Oh yeah, the democratic coup. So to say. But here it gets more. Number 2. Penetrating Chavez's political base. Okay, gaining influence within Chavez's political base. Number 3, dividing Chavismo. Now, let's just remember that Chavez, at this point, was supported by 60 or 70% of population. Dividing Chavismo, protecting vital U.S. business. And 5, isolating Chavez internationally. Chavez was seen as the main internationalist, socialist, revolutionary
throughout Latin America,
throughout the whole world. There's no one. Actually, there hasn't been anyone like Chavez in the past 25 years or more.
So this is the agency that the liberals are saying, oh, it's helping poor people. And
in fact, one of the reasons why Marco Rubio, I believe, folded USAID into the justice
to prevent its complete
because he's obviously in favor of the Cuban right wing.
Of course.
And you told me that
yes, all the Cuban counter-revolutionaries are now crying because all the so-called independent media, Cubanet, and a whole number of other outlets that produce counter-revolutionary propaganda, they're now out of money because they were funded fully by the US by USAID. Same things happened in Ukraine. Most of Ukrainian so-called independent media, and now coming up with pop-up.
It's funny because we often hear about independent media, but this independent media is always somehow in
dependent from somewhere.
In countries that America doesn't like, and they're entirely dependent on America. Now listen to this. This is how do you say? Reporters Without Borders. They're very, very upset because they say that USAID had a fund of 268 million intended to support independent media and the free flow of information. Of course, free flow of Western biased information per year. Recently, USAID had highlighted its support for over 6,000 journalists and approximately 700 newsrooms and nearly 300 media-focused civil society groups across 30 countries. And then it says, and then it actually adds, says, actually, it's the extent is far larger However, it's difficult to assess as many recipients are hesitant to speak out, fearing potential political backlash or jeopardizing future funding.
They are ashamed.
They are, well, also because they're undermining their own government.
Yeah, that's right. And also because it exposes their lack of independence. The USAID had a whole other branch that was funding the AFL-CIO International Solidarity Center, I think it was called. And this was a whole operation. It was called the AFL-CIA, they used to call it. The whole operation to fund right-wing trade unions, bureaucrats within revolutionary unions. Whenever there was a revolutionary process going on anywhere in the world, in South Africa or in Indonesia, the AFL-CIO Solidarity Center will come in and groom and develop this very radical trade unionists at that time. They will bring them for a training course in the United States and bring them in line with business unionism, the counter-revolutionary way of doing things. We're basically destroying these organizations.
But there's not just that. There's a whole underforce of NGOs related to USAID, which play a directly political subversive role. We've seen this in Ukraine, in Georgia. We've seen these colored revolutions and other places in Eastern Europe. And these kind of pro-EU demonstrations. In the past 6-7 months, there's been mass protests in Georgia against the government, which is aligned with Russia. And these have been massively supported by all of these NGOs. A big part of the funding, the organizing, and the general mobilization for these things come through the NGO. So they're, in fact, and they were, I mean, the things like the Maidan Revolution or the Orange Revolution in, was it 2004? Was it earlier in Ukraine? Was carried out with the USAID as the main front organization, or as the organization with the threads in it. So it's a regime change organization. In Iran, they support all of these liberal media that try to undermine the regime from outside, and so therefore it's not just. And
now the liberals are crying over the fact that poor peasants are no longer receiving grants, when in reality the whole operation was open U.S. imperialism. And then the hypocrisy of this is that then they turn around and they say, there's a Russian attempt to subvert the elections in Romania. And they're doing exactly the same thing everywhere in the world.
The fact is that the elections in Romania, I don't think have much to do with Russian intervention. But the fact that the Romanian people
were
hate
sick and tired
of their own governments. Now, this is related to another thing which is going on, which is a purge within the state. We see these are top level intelligence agents essentially who have been purged, and they're not happy about it. And I think one of the reasons that Trump is doing it is, as we said, is a change in the foreign policy, but it's also because these guys would not allow this to happen. Obviously, there's a whole industry of people who have who live off of this type of U.S. imperialism and don't have an interest in changing it. And that's what Trump calls the deep states. These are directly, obviously, involved and linked to the dominant wings of the American ruling class and of the American establishment within the state apparatus, with which Trump now has launched a war against. Now, just to
there's another aspect. Sorry, before we leave the USAID, there's another aspect to this, that a lot of this U.S. imperialist intervention in other countries in recent years was carried out under the cover of identity politics, i.e. promoting so-called environmentalist groups or groups for the rights of gay people or things like this. That they thought that this was a nice progressive way of penetrating the youth in these countries in order to bring them in line with pro-US imperialist policies, and in lots of different places, in Peru, in Cuba, Nicaragua, and a whole number of other places.
It's funny that America should be promoting environmentalism in other countries when it's one of the most polluting countries in the world. And this just shows that they don't care about these things. They just cynically use the honest aspirations of lots of young people for their own purposes. Now, to move on to this purge within the state, He has fired 17 inspector generals, which are these independent bodies that overlook different departments, i.e. that can look into corruption, mismanagement, people who were used against the previous Trump presidency. And this goes, I think, for all of the people that he's aimed at the moment. 50 high-level members of the intelligence community have had their security clearances taken away. A series of them have had their security details taken away, which would maybe put them at risk of danger. At least, there's a purge within the CIA. I don't have the figures. I don't think it's clear yet because Tulsi Gabbard, which is to head the National Intelligence, Council, she's not been approved yet. But there is a purge within this CIA going on. There's a purge within the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Pentagon. Not just generals who are. Mark Milley was taken, although he's not a general anymore, but he was expelled from some public office.
His security detail was removed.
And his security detail was removed.
Incidentally, can I just say about the case of Mark Milley? he was part of a group of people that in the last days of the previous administration came out publicly attacking Trump as a candidate. And this, according to the rules of bourgeois, not our rules, according to the rules of bourgeois democracy, these officers of the state are not supposed to intervene in politics.
That goes for the 50 people who came out, the 50 intelligence officials who came out in support of Biden in the last weeks of the previous election. Again, completely unheard. This is supposed to be an impartial state, and obviously it's not. But that's what all of this is showing, is that the state apparatus,
real face.
The state apparatus has never been impartial. The state, we've always explained, ultimately, from a Marxist point of view, the state is armed bodies of men in defense of private property, in defense of the existing ruling class. That is the intelligence agencies, the prisons, the police, the army. And then you have other layers of social and these things on top of that to kind of cover that up. But at the core, that's what a state really is. However, there's another element to the state, which is the state bureaucracy, which, although it has this kind of aura of independence and impartiality, non-partisan, in the last analysis, always moves to protect the interests of the ruling class. And in relation to Trump is not a working class hero. Trump is himself a bourgeois, but he's an outsider from the point of view of the ruling class, of the dominant wing of the ruling class, and of the dominant wing of the establishment. And they don't want him to ruin their ideas, as we just talked about. They have
tried very hard.
They have tried. They've had the courts against him, the police, the FBI. If anything, that's raised his authority amongst working class people. But what Trump is doing is actually one of the things they hate him. One is his foreign policy, that they're ruining the position of U.S. in the world. He's undermining and he's finishing that. But he's also showing everyone what it's really about, what's actually going on. Yes, the courts are not in. For instance, now there are 2 judges who have taken a position against some of Trump's measures. Well, those are Democratic judges. They're completely enmeshed in the Democratic Party. And the FBI cases, the legal cases against Trump is not an innocent person by any standards in anything. However, it's clear that those cases had nothing to do with the crimes that he committed, which they all commit.
Yes.
They all commit. But everything to do with the fact that they don't want anyone else sticking their finger in their cookie jar. That's what it's really about. And Trump understood this, and he's gone to war with it.
Yes.
Elon Musk.
He's learned from his first term in office, where he considered, I think quite rightly, that the state apparatus, the establishment, all these unelected bureaucrats were preventing, hindering, slowing down the implementation of policies that he wanted.
Yes.
To a certain extent, he's not wrong. He has been elected. He should be able to carry out his policies. Of course, his policies are not pro-working class policies. That's a separate matter. But from a formal point of view, he is the president. He has enormous support, popular support, and unelected officials shouldn't stop him.
Well, that's the point. I mean, what we see is you can call it is a it's a regime change in a way. You can say it's a power grab or a palace revolution. You can say, but I would say Trump had the mandate for that. He stood. What did he stand for? It's true that he raised lots of reactionary, racist things, but actually, what people voted for him for was a showdown with the establishment. To take these guys, that all these guys are corrupt, these guys are incompetent. They're driving America down. They're exploiting the workers and the middle class. They're crushing us all, and they need to be removed. So if anyone has a mandate, it's Trump.
Yes.
Now the Democrats, obviously, and the liberals.
In fact, we saw something like this when similar to this when Corbyn was likely or had the possibility of winning the election, and there was some top army general who said, "We're not going to serve under Corbyn. We're not going to follow orders from Corbyn."
Yes.
Of course, Corbyn is different from Trump, but they both anti-establishment figures, one of the left, one of the right.
Yeah.
And if anything, you could say that Corbyn was indecisive. He didn't deal with his internal enemies in a serious way, and Trump is not like that.
Corbyn should have been like Trump.
Yes.
Corbyn should have been decisive in that way. Not the policies of Trump,
No,
but in carrying them out and standing up.
Yes. In fact, even Trump supporters are now saying that any senators that prevent the nominations that Trump is putting forward in the Senate they should organize primary elections. It should be removed at the next primary elections. Yes. This is what Corbyn should have done with the reselection of MPs.
Exactly. Now the liberals, they're panicking. There's a guy. He's one of my favorites to quote here of the liberals, Edward Luce, the U.S. editor of the Financial Times. he's written another funny article. He says, Trump is burning America's rule book. This is a terrible thing. He's burning America's rule book. If he carries on like this, Democrats will have no choice but to send him a strongly worded letter. And then later on he says, for years...
A strongly worded letter?
Well, I'll explain what he means.
In his
but he's actually criticizing the liberals. He says, Trump has burnt the rule book. We shouldn't follow the rules either. Which they've never done. They've made the rules for themselves. They never fought. And then he says, for years he's been insisting that the American system is rotten. Now he's putting a torch to it. And then he goes on lamenting how the Democrats are accepting what Trump is doing, just pushing through his wishes, whereas Trump, as I said, has a mandate for actually carrying out these things. And the Democrats and the liberals have been shown the door. Even the votes that were for the liberals, most of them were quite, I'm sure of it, quite unconvinced. Whereas on Trump's side, there's a whole layer of people. Some of them are reactionaries, but some of them are working class and middle class people who feel like enough is enough and something needs to be done. And there's this a podcast that competes with us, although I think they're in a slightly different league than us. We're not there yet. The biggest political podcast in the world, as far as I know. The rest is politics. Someone sent me one of their episodes last week, which was about fascism. And they talked about, I think they went to a fascism museum and they listed something like that. I'm quoting, my memory is a bit hazy here, but let me explain the main point that was trying to be made. They went through these different elements of fascism, nationalism, strong leadership, decisive, action. And they were like, yep, Trump is like that, Trump is like that, Trump is like that. And we've dealt with it before. Trump is not a fascist. He doesn't need to be a fascist. He has full support. He actually has support. But these guys, one of them is Alistair Campbell. Yeah. And the other one is an MI6 agent, a former MI6 agent. Now, they went to... Alistair Campbell, by the way, was advisor to Tony Blair during the Iraq War, which cost 1 million lives. The invasion of Iraq by America and Britain in particular, which cost 1 million lives and destroyed Iraq and destabilized the Middle East for a whole generation. And Trump is the fascist of all of the people, the guts. And then immediately after making that program, I couldn't finish the program, so maybe they said something that redeems them. But I just listened to the first bit and it kind of enraged me so much I had to shut up. But then they go to Syria and interview who? Ahmed al-Shara, who's now the main leader of Syria. He's the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Formerly al-Jolani, which was who? The leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and a former member of what became the Islamic State of the Sham.
That's their icon of a liberal figure.
This is their icon. And, Trump is a fascist. And then they go, you see the pictures on Instagram. These guys smiling and talking. And he says, fascinating on so many levels. This is what I wonder if they would do that about Trump, And someone was saying that it's funny that the Al-Qaeda suicide bombing mastermind is the second most bloody person in this room, the most honest, the most intellectually coherent, and the least odious. But that's the thing about the liberals, is that there is this frenzy, hysteria about Trump and how terrible he is.
It's like when Biden said an oligarchy of very wealthy people are now taking over the government.
Exactly. Elon Musk, he's a billionaire running things. Billionaires have been running the America
for 100, 200 years.
Exactly.
Or I think it was The Economist. The Economist had an article or a front page, I don't know, that they said the US has now the first imperialist president for 100 years.
Which is insane.
As if Bush Jr., Obama, Clinton, and all of the others were not Biden particularly were not imperialists somehow.
Look at what they did in Ukraine. This is just, or in Gaza.
Yes.
What's that? That's just a misunderstanding. Of course, in Ukraine, they provoked the country to war, and they've destroyed that country. The fact of the matter is, Ukraine, as a viable nation with a viable state and independence, is finished.
Yes.
It's not going to exist anymore in the foreseeable future. And it's all down to U.S. imperialism, which insists on still, right to the last minute, it insists that they should continue this war. They should keep throwing. For what? For their own narrow reasons of putting pressure on Russia, on trying to undermine Russia, and so on and so forth. Yes, it's true that Trump is also an imperialist. He's an honest imperialist. He doesn't hide the fact that he's an imperialist. However, no one has more blood on their hands than these so-called liberal Democrats who've been running this world for the past 70 or 80 years. And I think a lot of people around the world, while not agreeing with Trump, are happy to see what's happening. Are happy to see these people getting a bloody nose. Yes. And of course, then the task is not over. It's not like the class struggle is solved and liberty and freedom will come to the world. Not at all. But this is a blow this is a serious blow to these people. Now, then we have the left. You talked about Corbyn, who became a real focal point of the left in Britain, and then capitulated entirely to the right wing of the Labour Party, who had no problems in getting rid of him as soon as they got into power. And in America, you have Bernie Sanders, first of all, who came out. You were quoting his statement on USAID. What was it he was saying?
Yes. I think
while you find it, I'll quote something else he said. Well, because Trump has sued CBS News, because CBS has a program called 60 Minutes, in which, as far as I understand, I hope I don't get this wrong, but they have a 60 Minutes in which Kamala Harris participated during the election campaign. And Kamala Harris was almost as incoherent as Joe Biden, but CBS helped her by editing her interview so as to make her look a lot better. I.e., you have this national TV station using its resources to promote Kamala Harris. Trump sued them, and Bernie Sanders says he called on CBS News to stand tall and not settle with Donald Trump. And he says CBS may be reaching a legal settlement with Trump because he didn't like how a campaign interview with Kamala was edited. Really, if CBS caves, the belief that we have an independent media protected by the First American Amendment, it is undermined.
We never had a free and independent media in the United States. It's all dominated by the capitalists.
Exactly.
It's ridiculous. But this is what it says about USA. It says, Elon Musk, the richest man on earth, is dismantling USAID, which feeds the poorest children on earth. This is oligarchy at its worst. And it's not like Bernie Sanders doesn't know. He does know about these things. He does know what USAID really does. And he comes completely on the side of the liberal establishment, defending USAID, which is in effect the long arm of US imperialism to destabilize Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it's completely scandalous. This man, Bernie Sanders, also voted for the confirmation of Marco Rubio. Rubio, everyone knows who Marco Rubio is. He's not hiding his politics.
Yeah.
I mean, he intends to overthrow the Cuban revolution. He's a rabid anti-communist, is an interventionist, all that. And now is Trump's Secretary of Defense. And he was voted by the U.S. House unanimously. Exactly. Not a single vote against.
Exactly. He's also said that he will probably vote for Robert Kennedy as health secretary. But you see, here's the thing. He says if CBS caves, the belief that we have an independent media protected by the First Amendment is undermined. Now, I think actually
the belief
there is a Freudian slip.
It's not that the independent media is undermined, it's the belief that is.
Exactly. And then he goes on, says, CBS stand tall, support the Constitution. Now, there's another quote by this guy where he talks about Trump's funding freeze. And again, he says that Trump must not circumvent Congress. The Constitution must be defended. But look, here you have a so-called socialist, left-winger, and the whole of the population can see that CBS is not an independent media at all. It's been portrayed as independent, but it's totally controlled by big business, by the interests of the establishments, and so on and so forth. And Trump is right when he's saying that. Trump is right when he says it for his own reasons, but he's right. And people can see this. And here you have a left-winger, instead of coming and explaining, yes, it's correct, but Trump is not the solution. What does he do? He tries to restore CBS. He tries to restore the power,
the legitimacy of bourgeois capitalist rule
of big capital. This so-called standing up for the Constitution, for constitutional rights, for Congress. This is the Congress that's been
it's full of billionaires,
full of billionaire lackeys. Full of reactionaries, anti-communists, anti-working class people who pursue the most reactionary and who have pursued for decades throughout the whole history of modern America, pursued the interests
for which they have become thoroughly discredited.
Yes,
and then socialists, so-called socialists like Sanders, instead of saying yes, it's good that they are discredited, we need a socialist alternative, he's saying no, we must restore their credibility because they are independent, or they should appear to be independent.
Exactly. This is the problem with the so-called left.
Yes.
Is that they at every step of the way, because they don't have a program of actually breaking with the existing system, they end up falling in line with one or another wing of the establishment. And you see,
they call it the lesser evil.
Yes.
But many times they end up supporting. I mean, there isn't any lesser evil, but they end up supporting the worst evil, if you want.
Yes, but in abstract terms, you can say Trump is a capitalist. So are the liberals. On that basis, they represent the same class interest. But the bulwark of reaction in post-war capitalist in world capitalist post-war world capitalism has been American imperialism and has been these people, right? So that's what he should be explaining. Now, failing to do so is precisely the Sanders's failure to give a real class way forward that's opened the way for Trump.
Exactly.
Trump appeals to the same class anger that exists everywhere in the US, to the working class who's fed up with the establishment. They're fed up with the foreign adventures. They're fed up with their incompetence, with their corruption, with the with the bourgeois state and the media, which obviously is weighed up, biased against the interests of the working class. But obviously, Trump is demagogically appealing to that and using it for his own purpose.
There was an opinion poll. There was an opinion poll recently where they were trying to measure the popular approval and disapproval of Trump.
Yes.
And there's many ways, and it's going up, it's going down slightly. But there was another poll next to that one. There was another question they asked: is the approval or disapproval of Congress? And that was clear across all groups, all age groups, and it was massive disapproval going up.
Yeah.
And this is the basis of this.
I think we actually before around the elections we got the polls. If I remember correctly, only 30% of Americans had any kind of faith in Congress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's massive. And then yet we have this
a
guy,
so-called socialist. This is a capitalist Congress, and then a so-called socialist like Bernie Sanders says, no, we must prop up the legitimacy and the approval for Congress and these institutions.
Yes. Now, the task of communism, the task of revolution is precise to do the opposite. To call out all of these people, to say they are all corrupt. And we do need a revolution, not a palace revolution, a real revolution. All of this stuff, USAID needs to be torn down. The Department of Justice, the FBI, the CIA, all of these reactionary people that Trump has removed their security clearances for, they must be removed. But as well as all the rest.
Yes.
That's what I would say that the correct slogan is not down with Trump, is down with all of them. We can take Bernie Sanders' slogan for a revolution against the billionaire class.
Yes.
Then although he called for
take it to the end.
Take it to the end. He called for a political revolution. I mean, just a change of power at the top. We called for social revolution, which means take over their wealth, take over the big businesses, the big industries, the media, everything, and run it on the basis of a planned economy controlled by the working class.
Correct.
That's the end of my notes, what I brought. I don't know if you have any final words.
We were discussing this morning, and Alan Wood said something that I think is very important, which is that this represents the arrival of Trump to power for the second time. This time round, it represents a major shift in world politics, world relations, and world economy. It means a turning point. Is basically a turning point from the point of view, particularly of world relations, but also world politics, which reflects what the exhaustion of a particular model of U.S. imperialist domination. It doesn't mean that what's coming now is more progressive. Some people say, "Oh, multilateralism is more progressive." No, it's not more progressive. It's just the struggle between different powers for world domination. Yeah. There's nothing progressive with that for working people. What we want is an end to all imperialist domination, to all capitalist domination. But certainly there is a major change. And if you don't recognize that, and if you fall back to a position of, we must defend liberal democracy, we must defend the constitution or the republic or whatever, like most of the left is doing all around the world, including in Germany. The other day there were big demonstrations against the AfD. Now, the AfD are reactionary populists, they are against immigration, but the reason it's growing so fast is because of the collapse of the whole of the establishment parties, and particularly the question of the war in Ukraine, the question of the end of the supply of energy from... Anyway, so they are rising for those reasons, and then the liberals call for the demonstration in defense of the Constitution and the Republic, because these people are threatening it. And how can working class people fall behind that? Because in fact, it's this Republic, this Constitution, which is a capitalist Constitution, that's created the economic mess and problems that they're facing, deindustrialization and so on. So, I think we should be very, very clear about this. We cannot fall... I mean, the policy of the lesser evil is a complete disaster at all times. But right now is the worst policy that you can have. What you need to try to create is a party, a revolutionary party that can harness this anti-establishment mood that is very healthy, potentially healthy, in an anti-capitalist direction, instead of being harnessed by a millionaire real estate billionaire real estate tycoon owner who does it for his own interests.
In a way, we can say that this is a crisis of capitalism expressing itself in this particular manner because of the situation that we're in. If we take a step back, what is it we have? We have, first of all, on a world scale, a huge working class, for the first time in history, in the past 20 years, the working class is the majority of the whole world's population. Is incredibly
never been stronger.
In the West is the overwhelming majority of the population. Never been stronger. A system that's grinding to a halt, you can say, grinding down and descending into a deep crisis, where it's constantly attacking this same working class more and more and more. And in doing so, losing legitimacy, losing authority, being weakened. And nevertheless, the leadership of the working class, unfortunately, the working class is left with these type of leaders, like Bernie Sanders, who, in the most pathetic way, line up in one way or another. Every one of them line up.
Well, instead of saying, let's give the system a last kick and push and overthrow the whole of it, they say, no, let's prop it up. Prop it up.
And therefore, you have a situation where all of this pressure and anger by the working class, it reflects itself in this distorted manner through people like Trump and AFD and so on. But that doesn't mean that this is the end of the process. The same way that the workers were demoralized and, disappointed by liberalism, they're going to be disappointed with Trumpism.
Definitely.
Even more than that. And the Trumpists know that. I mean, we've quoted some of the comments here, that they realize that if they cannot satisfy the basic needs of the American working class that brought them to power now, and they're leaning on the workers to strike blows against the liberals, well, then that same working class will turn against them. And that is going to happen because they don't have a solution. Right now, I think a lot of working class people will see, okay, he's fighting. He's taken to the fight and he can't do much. And so they might give him some time. But sooner or later, they're going to realize that, no, this is not really a solution. And the point is that we need to make a real revolutionary communist force ready for that. Yes. When that happens, those same workers are going to be looking for something else to reflect their aspirations. They have to go through this experience because of the lack of an alternative. If there was a mass communist organization, let's say 10,000 people in the US 5 or 10 years ago, yes, you would have had a totally different situation today. Yes. But barring that, we need to build that for the next stage of
and our forces are way too small at the moment. Absolutely. But that gives us an urgency to build the forces of revolutionary communism in every country.
Exactly. And I think that's the best way to end it. If anyone is interested in joining the Revolutionary Communist International in the US or anywhere else in the world, there's a link in the description, or you can go on marxist.com/join us, I believe. But anyway, we'll post a link in the description and in the chat. Thank you very much, Jorge, and thank you everyone out there for tuning in. We'll be back again next week, Thursday, 3 p.m. London time. Thank you very much.